Hi, everybody. So happy to be here. Thank you for that, leading that fantastic panel, Sinan. Now, we're going to turn to a conversation about responsible AI. And I'm thrilled to have three guests whose work I admire and who come from very different spaces, although they all have rigorous academic training. So let me introduce each of our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce Suresh Venkata-Subramanian. He is a professor of computer science at Brown University, and he's also a member of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Team. Welcome, Suresh. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Chris Gilliard. He is a professor at Macomb Community College and also a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Rumaan Chowdhury. She is the Director of Machine Learning Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability at Twitter. Thank you for being here, taking the time, Rumaan.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. So I love that we're all together because of the different worlds, the different spaces that we all move in, whether it be social media for you, Rumaan, the kind of activist academic like you, Chris, or in the world of policy like you, Suresh. So let me start actually with Suresh. Suresh, can I ask you about what led you to be interested in the issue of algorithmic fairness and responsible AI, and then sort of what led you to becoming part of the OSTP?
Thanks, Renee. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for having me. So I've been a researcher as an academic in computer science for a long time, working in many areas, including data mining and machine learning, as well as an avid reader of science fiction. And in the process of doing this work, I started to become very curious about what a future powered almost entirely by ML would look like. And this was back in 2012 when that world hadn't quite come to reality yet. And I was interested in how we as in the people, could receive assurances that algorithms that made claims about us were in fact correct in their claims as a technical question. But then this got me thinking more broadly about claims around accountability and eventually about bias and discrimination. And I've been working in this space sort of as an academic ever since. But in that work, I started thinking broadly about the societal impact of rights impacting technologies. And so it was kind of natural to try and understand the places where algorithms are really impacting people and the ways in which these algorithms were governed, namely in the space of policy. And so before joining OSTP, I had advised on ML procurement and deployment at both city and state levels. I'd been involved with various civil society groups talking about this. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to serve at OSTP at this very important moment in time in an administration that has made equity issues a day one priority.
Absolutely, such an important issue, and so much to tackle. So that's a very interesting journey. So Rumaan, I want to ask you about this with regard to yourself, and I also want you to talk a little bit about the fact that you once said, and I want to get this right, that one of the most accurate descriptions of Silicon Valley is, "What does my mommy no longer do for me?" So can you tell us, how you got into this and what that means?
Yes, and actually that is from, early on, and it kind of reflects my experience having had an early career as a political scientist, working in policy, nonprofit, government, becoming an academic, and then moving to Silicon Valley actually in my 30s. There are things that I love. I love the optimism. I love the ability to ask tough questions. And it genuinely is true. Like, people dream big and people do big things. But unfortunately, people fall into the trap of solving the problems that they see in front of their faces, right? So, why is it that we can build watches that specifically know what swim stroke I am swimming? Because that is definitely a problem one has in Cupertino, California. But we can't solve or even put adequate resources behind solving issues of imbalanced data sets or algorithmic ethics. So that quote kind of was born out of a frustration of seeing lots of resources and the smartest minds going behind solving the problems of the privileged. How do I get food? I need a ride. How do I talk to my friends more effectively? How do I find people to date? Because a lot of the people in this universe do not have the day-to-day problems of trying to live paycheck to paycheck, of trying to feed their families, trying to figure out how to get adequate healthcare on a budget, problems that frankly most of America faces. So, that sort of embodies my journey into responsible AI. I love being in industry. I love working at Twitter. I love working at Accenture, and I love running a startup because I love solving problems. And Silicon Valley does offer the ability to solve problems. The question is, what problems are we solving?
That's right. I mean, I think that's critical. And I see this myself as someone who, is a first generation college student or graduate, and very different than a lot of these spaces. The questions that are important and that come to mind really are rooted in the background. And so, Chris, I want to pull you in because, when you talk about luxury surveillance, right? And you've talked about kind of what surveillance is and how it affects us and how we perceive it as being a function of kind of where our status is, our proximity to power. So building off of what Rumaan just said, can you talk about how you became interested in this and what that means, luxury surveillance?
Yeah. And again, thanks for having me. And I'm just honored to be here with Rumaan and Suresh, and you, Renee. So the way I got started is I teach English at a community college, and basically, sort of my origin story is I was noticing the ways in which my school filtered the internet and the ways in which that prevented students from doing the work that they were trying to do, right? Because sometimes they would be researching sensitive topics like, at the time, what was called, revenge porn and things like that. And they couldn't do the research because the institution filtered out any results that had the word porn in it, whether or not the students were looking for porn. I mean, and in this case, they actually were not looking at porn. And so that started, I started to think about that and kind of develop a understanding of how I call what I call digital redlining. And I wound up sort of here by accident. Like I have a loud mouth on Twitter, and eventually some people started paying attention, and that's kind of how I got here. I think it's really important to build on what Rumaan said. I had what I thought was kind of a mundane observation, right? Which is that an Apple Watch and a Fitbit and an ankle monitor, what James Kilgore calls like e-carceration. They operate in much of the same ways. They have many of the same functions. In the ways they're different is like who gets to choose whether to wear one versus who it's deployed against. And also the aesthetics, which I think are a really important part. Like typically the luxury item is meant to convey a certain kind of status in terms of being sleek and blending in. And the deployed or imposed surveillance, like in the case of an ankle monitor, is meant to stand out and stigmatize. But I feel like the reason I make that formulation is I think it's important to understand both of these devices primarily as surveillance and mechanisms of control. And because of the associations of an Apple Watch and a Fitbit, people often don't think about them that way. And they certainly serve other functions, right? Like telling you what kind of swim stroke you have and how efficient it is. They certainly serve those functions, but they serve kind of surveillance and control functions as well. And I think it's important to tease those out.
Yeah, absolutely. So my parents still live in the same place I was raised, and it's a relatively higher crime area. And they have adopted a lot of surveillance technology under the guise of being safe, right? because they've experienced break-ins. And I'm so interested in how you talk about the way that adopting these technologies for people who are vulnerable could be a false sense of security, right? And the power of agency here, which I think is really a critical one and a critical lens. So thank you for speaking to that. But in addition to the individual level differences and choices and effects, we have these systemic kind of factors. And I think this is where I'm very interested in hearing Suresh's point of view as it relates to, the administration and the challenges that it's facing with elected officials. We've seen elected officials question tech executives. And sometimes these questions sort of suggest not a lot of knowledge about technology. And I recall someone asking about a Google executive, a question that was about an iPhone, for instance. And so it might appear that, not a lot of people know a lot about the technology, how algorithms work, or machine learning, right? And so technology's developing at such a rapid pace. What challenges, Suresh, do we face, does OSTP face in addressing this issue via governmental policy, given the fact that, many need a specialized skill set to become involved in the development of AI tools?
So this is where my computer science hat is as useful as my policy hat. And as a computer scientist, I'm very much aware of how the definition, even and the design of AI and ML has changed rapidly over time. And this is a good thing. I mean, this innovation that we see, that excitement that Rumaan talks about, is truly to be celebrated. But I think that often there is a focus on the technology and the intricacies of the technology. And I think in our work, what we think is more helpful is a focus on impact, the focus on impact on people. Because if you think about an impact, if you think about how technology affects people, then at some level, it doesn't matter what new technology comes about and what things change in the tech. What matters is at the point of impact, what is happening. And I think that, first of all, it does a couple of things, right? It allows us to concentrate our policy efforts where we can have the most influence at the point of impact. It also recognizes that there are different ways in which we can achieve the goals of ensuring that that the people are protected from harmful impacts and can get the most benefits. There isn't one way. When you talk about the different approaches that legislators and others might take, I think they're all reasonable approaches. The desire to have a single silver bullet to solve all these problems does not exist. It's not there. And so I think we welcome different approaches, and we welcome a focus on impact, which allows us then to not have to worry too much. We do have to be concerned, but we don't have to worry too much about the ways in which technology changes. Because if it's going to affect my rights, my opportunities, my access to critical resources, I don't care whether it's a support vector machine or a deep learning algorithm or anything else, or linear regression or nonlinear regression. It's still going to affect me, and that's what matters.
Yeah. So thinking about all of these various approaches, I think perhaps one thing that we should think about is, what does responsible AI look like? What does that mean to you? And, what could it be? So, Rumaan, can I ask you to talk a little bit about what is responsible AI to you? And what are ML ethics, and what would that look like if you had a magic wand?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other part about being on industry side is, we have an outsized responsibility because we have an outsized amount of power and access. So if from my perspective, being in industry doing responsible AI means that you are ensuring that what you are building is, at the very least, not harming people at scale, and you are doing your best to help identify and mitigate those harms. So you are using these tools responsibly, as in you're not harming people. But then there's this other aspect of, especially now that I work at a social media company, let's start thinking about how responsible AI is also about enabling human flourishing. So, Twitter has an arm of the company called Conversational Health, which I've always thought was very fascinating. This idea that there is a way to advocate for good discourse? What does it mean to have quality conversation? And responsible AI is, part and parcel with it. How do we use our models to ensure that the public is benefiting? And these are all very vague terms. So a couple of things to point out here. I've always found it very interesting that industry, and again, even in my time at Accenture, we tend to call it responsible AI, not ethical AI, and that actually is a very decidedly important name difference, because I think responsibility is something that transcends sort of moral underpinnings, or maybe skirts the more philosophical debates and thinks more pragmatically, like folks like Suresh do, of like, what is the impact of this? Actually, it does not matter if what you are looking at is a regression model or a super deep learning model that was just invented yesterday in this very fancy AI lab. What matters is a person at the end of it being benefited, or are they being harmed? And that is kind of a simplistic way of explaining it. Lots of like asterisks and caveats here. There's no such thing as any kind of a system that has zero harm, right? We all live in the world of reality. We all live in a socio-technical system. So how do we also think about how human beings interact with our models, how our models influence human behavior? And frankly, that is, for me as a quantitative social scientist, the most fascinating part about working in responsible AI and machine learning, is that we're the ones that get to think about these systems truly as socio-technical systems.
Yeah, that's right. And your perspective, given your past at Accenture and now at Twitter, I think is very informative here and really important. So Chris, let me ask you to talk about this. What do you think responsible AI looks like? And what are you hearing from your students about this?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I was just on a panel yesterday where we did. I was among the few people who was not a computer scientist, right? And I found it interesting because a lot of the discussion sort of turned to definitions and what is an algorithm and things like that. And I love what Suresh just said, which is to focus on impact, because I don't think it's so important. I mean, like I'm not a computer scientist and I'm not a data scientist, but I am really privy to a way that a lot of these systems harm a variety of communities, like ed tech and, and students being a segment of that. And so I think it's really important just for people, and I try to do this with my classes, is just to tease out for them and help them understand, but also, again, share their stories and their narratives about the ways in which these systems affect their day-to-day lives. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a greater understanding of how all of this affects everyone, whether that is, do you get a loan, or what school do you get into, or does the system think you're cheating, or does the system say that your kid should be taken away from you, right? Like almost every aspect of our lives are touched by these models and these processes. And I think it's really important to get people to think about that, and to believe or understand that they should have input in that, because we've become accustomed to thinking that these are systems that, because they're so specialized in how they're built, that we shouldn't have a say on how they affect us or what the impact is. And I spend a lot of time really trying to debunk and dismantle that myth with students.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm also not a computer scientist, so we both snuck in on the panel. But I love what you're saying, because, to be fair, academia has a bit of a reputation of being, right, ivory tower, of being separated from the reality of people's lives. And that's a shame, right, in general, but it's particularly important when we're talking about the people who are going to be impacted by the algorithms that you referenced, who oftentimes don't have those kinds of privileges, right? And so the decisions are being made by people who aren't necessarily going to be affected in the same way. So I'm really glad you're having those conversations, and I'm glad that you're on the panel. And so that leads me to think about, Suresh, think about the tack that OSTP has taken around sort of seeking public input on the National AI Research Resource. So OSTP asked the public for their thoughts on addressing responsible AI, equity, bias, and research. And what is particularly what stood out to me, and I want to get this right, the NAIRR mentions a strategy, a recommendation to increase support for interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary AI research on human AI collaboration that expands beyond exclusively technical research, which I think really sort of is a nice build upon what Chris was talking about. So how can we build this coalition, right, of people outside of government and other fields to address this issue?
Thanks for that question. So for those who may not know, the National AI Research Resource, NAIR, is envisioned as it's been envisioned as a shared computing and data infrastructure that provides AI research institutes across many fields and disciplines with access to resources and high quality data, so that it's not just, only in the private sector, but it's a general resource. Now, the process, the NIR process is ongoing actually, and I'm not personally directly involved in the efforts. It is coordinated by OSTP and the National Science Foundation. But I do encourage people to visit ai.gov/NAIRRTF and look for an interim report that'll be coming out probably in May, and it'll be made available for public inspection and comment. And I want to sort of build on that, right? You mentioned, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary efforts, building on doing human AI collaboration that expands beyond exclusively technical research. One thing that's been very important in the work that we're all doing is making sure that we hear from the public and that we make sure that whatever we do is maximizing the benefits for all Americans and that all that benefits are equitably distributed. So we think that, Chris talked about hearing from the students and their experience with technology. We believe very strongly that we can learn from listening to the public, and we've done that in a lot of our public engagements as well. On the point about collaboration, we're going beyond exclusive technical research. It's related to this. By hearing from a wide variety of stakeholders, we get a sort of a more comprehensive view of these problems that isn't focused on any one particular dimension. They're all important. The technical dimensions are important. The socio-technical dimensions are important. And it's by reaching out, especially to stakeholders who may not have had a tradition of being asked their opinion before. And that's something that's very important to us. And that's how we build these broader coalitions and learn more about how people think about these issues.
Yeah, that's really heartening to know. And that link, I encourage everyone who's here today to follow that link to learn more about that. And Raman, in your world at Twitter, you have sort of a counterpart to this as well, right? So Twitter recently launched an AI bias bounty challenge. So can you talk more about what that was and how it came about, what you learned from that?
Absolutely. So the T in our name stands for transparency and the A is for accountability. And we take that quite seriously. So as a team, we've been constantly trying to push the envelope on how we can get more transparency, how we can engage more in a meaningful way with the public. So I will start out by saying there is no way any given team in industry could ever hope to identify all of the potential harms or all of the ways in which we should be approaching these problems, right? So just even by definition of being on an ML ethics team in industry, there's a certain amount of privilege that sort of affords you to be there. So recognizing that, how do we get the voices of different individuals, groups, and communities? One of the things and that is my very loud cat.
That's okay.
She'll probably hop on my desk at some point. So be prepared.
Okay. My dog would do the same thing.
there will be a kitten cameo. Here we are. There you go. Hello.
Come through, Katie.
Hello, everybody. That's Dax.
Hi, Dax.
So the bias bounty was really an effort to capture something that already happens. So, in the spirit of how Twitter became aware of issues with our image cropping algorithm. It was because people on Twitter pointed it out to the company. This is before I was even at Twitter. And I was really impressed to see the company engaging with people to say, hey, what are you seeing? And what we saw was, people spinning up test examples and testing it themselves and posting what they found. And, two things occurred to me. One is, people do this on their free time. We should really reward them because our company is benefiting from it. And second, this is a really great opportunity for us to get people who don't necessarily have the free time to do this kind of work or don't have the following on Twitter such that people are going to listen to what they have to say or look at the audits they perform. So the bias bounty was intended to be very open to the public. We allowed anybody from across the world to participate, and we had different categories of prizes that we offered. We did not just want to air towards folks that were building deep learning models. We wanted to allow it to be more accessible. And that was very represented in the folks who even won our prizes. So the first prize was like a very complicated StyleGAN model that essentially worked as an Instagram filter, right? It sort of tweaked photos until and the winner demonstrated how by making a photo that was more feminized and more white and more attractive, it tended to crop towards that photo. On the other end, we had somebody who hacked our system by simply adding in a few nearly invisible pixels into different areas of the image and therefore sort of skewing where the image crop model chose to focus. So you could do that in Photoshop. You don't need to know how to program a StyleGAN model to do that. So really fascinating. And, there's a lot of different perspectives that we loved learning from. And the other thing that we tested in it is our rubric. So one really complicated thing when understanding risks of ML systems is how do we weigh the risks relative to each other? So in a perfect world, we're able to address all of the harms immediately in all of our models. We are not in a perfect world. We have to prioritize. We have to be able to say, this is a riskier model than that model, or this is having done this change, here's how this model may impact the world. And we don't necessarily have clear guidance on how to do that yet. So we're trying our best to build it ourselves. The bias bounty also serves as a way of stress testing our approach, which looks a lot like early days of cybersecurity. We looked at impact and we looked at reach. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't just emphasizing reach, which means most people, because a lot of these harms happen on minoritized communities, by definition, a smaller number of people, but they impact them very deeply. So how do we measure the level of impact on folks? So, it is an imperfect way of doing it. We got a lot of really great feedback. So there's a lot of things we've learned, and we're looking forward to hosting future bias bounties to learn more from the community.
I love the idea of this sort of open source and co-creative approach, whether it be OSTP, whether it be Twitter, and broadening sort of who could be involved. So thank you for giving us a sense of that. So here's the thing, and maybe you all experienced this, but when you're talking about issues of responsible AI and bias and ethics, maybe you find what I find, which is sometimes you end up, speaking to the choir, right? The people who are most interested are the ones who are kind of already there with you. And for those who are not there with you, it's not an easy topic. And when you talk about these harms, it's kind of a drag. So, Chris, you describe yourself as surveillance killjoy on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I thought, it's a bit cheeky, obviously, but, it does allude to the fact that this topic, not only can it be inscrutable to non-computer scientists, which, we are, but also because it's not fun, right? To think about the implications. So, how do you think about overcoming that barrier to entering the conversation? How do we talk to people who are not just part of the choir?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of the ways that I've taken to it is pointing out that it's possible from a technical standpoint to have a lot of these systems in ways that are more privacy respecting and less surveillant. So many of the problems that we have come from this model of extraction and surveillance and ad tech that power so much of the technology that we use. And I think what a lot of people who aren't sort of embedded in this have accepted the claim often forwarded by companies that if we want to have a service, that we have to exchange it. We have to exchange our privacy for that. So if we want to have a voice assistant, if we want to have a map, that gives us turn-by-turn directions, if we want to have, a health tracker, that we must also have a thing that surveils us constantly or extracts data or that feeds us ads or that tries to anticipate our needs or whatever the case may be. I don't believe this. And also technically, like in many cases, it's just patently false.
Mm.
But I think non-experts, so it's been such a persistent line of assertion by companies who obviously benefit from extending this claim that non-experts, many cases, are just encouraged to go along with it. So, I mean, but frankly, yes, it would be possible, and it does exist, to have a voice assistant that doesn't feed all your data to Amazon. But, and so that's one of the ways I try to have this discussion with people. But the other one, really quickly, is that I've argued in the past a lot that a lot of the reason that some people don't want to think about this stuff is that they think they're always going to be on the sort of right end of surveillance. I mean, I don't think there's a right end, but like they think there'll always be the privileged version, the
Mm.
watcher instead of the watched. And it's been part of my mission to make sure that people know that that is not always the case, that it's true that surveillance and privacy harms and things like that, kind of fall first and foremost on the most marginalized. But there are a lot of ways in which it comes for us all. And I think it's important to tell people that because there's a prevailing myth that those worries are worries for a set of people, but not for not for everyone.
Right. So we're all going to be affected. It's going to come for us all. So what I'm hearing you saying is that the killjoy is not going anywhere. You're not going to be changing your Twitter handle anytime soon.
No. I mean, I've been trying to think of a new name, but it's so fitting, so I haven't changed yet.
And if you don't follow Chris on Twitter, you really should, because you really give such up to the minute, I think, examples of this in practice in a variety of industries, that it really is its own version of like a news feed in the best possible way. So thank you for that as well. So Suresh, I want to turn back to you as we think about policy and we think about the White House. Do you have any sense of, how our global allies could partner in this endeavor? I mean, this is a global issue, right? Not just a US one. Can you give us a sense of what could be happening there with our allies?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely recognize that building a world where the way technology gets used is more responsible, it's more secure, it's more equitable. This is going to require, more than any one entity acting on their own. It's going to require more than the U.S. acting on its own. And there's a number of existing international efforts, some of which the United States is involved with, that are ongoing to translate AI principles into practice in many different ways. So in our work where we sit, we regularly engage with stakeholder communities. That includes our international partners, especially as we're going about developing the Bill of Rights. And if I might add one point to the question you brought up just now about the killjoy aspect of this, I think one of the things we've discovered in all our engagements, and we're hearing here also, is that there's a tremendous amount, I think what the president has referred to as possibilities. There's a lot of possibilities in this space. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. There's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of excitement, and there's a lot of creativity in actually building a better world with technology that actually reflects our, what we as human beings, as people want. And I view that as a computer scientist as optimistic, as an opportunity for us to build better in that sense, and not be, to feel pessimism about what is. We do have to understand the problems we face, but there's plenty of opportunities to build things better. And we see plenty of places in industry and academia and civil society of people coming up with great ideas to do that. So I don't think one necessarily has to be pessimistic about this.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I like when we think about the Twitter, the AI bias bounty challenge, that actually sounds fun. And admittedly, I'm more on the nerdy side, but the idea of kind of getting together and hacking and solving this problem has actually a lot of energy to it. And it does feel approachable, and it does feel exciting. So thank you. So Rumaan, let me ask you, so I teach a lot of, I just finished teaching today. And so I'm teaching MBAs, and they have all of these wonderful ideas for companies that they'd like to launch. And the ethics of the AI conversation oftentimes lags behind other kind of concerns that they have. And so if you could talk a little bit about your perspective from industry, whether it be at Accenture or at Twitter, what is it like? And what kind of approach do you take to trying to make sure that this is not something that is left behind, that it is not perceived as being in conflict with the goals of the company, and that this is something that, we should be thinking about as importantly as other priorities?
That's a great question. I actually talked to a lot of business school students. I was also course 15 and 17 at MIT, so have definitely been in Sloan before. But I don't see responsible AI as being different from the entrepreneurship spirit, right? Which is something that's very much built into Sloan. I was very lucky to have had that education. I think that also fed into how I think about responsible AI. And that kind of links to your previous question about being, a bit of a killjoy with it. I think it's an amazing opportunity to build better solutions and products. If we go back to like the original dreams of AI and machine learning, there are these amazing futuristic goals, but we don't achieve them by simply building technology. We achieve them by solving bigger problems, right? And I think the early days of responsible AI, I recognize that a lot of folks in the field were big Star Trek fans. And the reason a lot of us are Star Trek fans is it is one of the few versions of a future technologically driven world that is a utopia, and it's not a dystopia. And it is because they have used technology, et cetera, to help address problems of disease, hunger, et cetera, rather than say, hey, let's all build fancy ships and like millionaires can go fly around in, orbit for like 30 seconds before they have to come back down, right? So a couple of thoughts on that, very specifically related to entrepreneurship, building companies, and responsible AI. First, there's this amazing group called Startups in Society that I sit on the advisory board for, and they are very much focused on this. So if anyone listening is somebody who's building a company in AI and machine learning, and you want to pragmatically know like how are startups thinking about this, which is a very different set of problems from Fortune 500 companies and big enterprise companies, right? Because you have some very, very real constraints as a startup, right? I would highly suggest looking at Startups in Society. The second thing I'll say is I have another hat I'm going to put on for a second. I am co-GP in an investment fund called Parity Responsible Innovation Fund. And I firmly believe, and our investment hypothesis is that if we do have an AI winter and a slowdown coming up, which we are seeing, it is because we have not adequately addressed the issues of ethical and responsible concerns. So responsible AI is not this thing you do on the side after you build your tech and have your fun. It is actually a core part of ensuring your tech is durable. So, I firmly believe in we are investing in the companies that are building what I call the responsible AI infrastructure. I do think there are technologies we invest in and things that as companies we build, and it's startups that will build this technology, right? That will enable us to actually achieve a lot of the fantastical science fiction visions of artificial intelligence. And again, not in spite of responsible AI, but because of responsible AI. So a couple of things we invest in, for example, privacy enhancing tech. That's a big one. If we're able to have more transparency and visibility into the kinds of technology and the data that companies are using, then we will be able to address and mitigate harms proactively. Another one is privacy, security, and the kind of infrastructure we're building on that. And the third is the kinds of AI investigatory tools that help companies identify, the harms that their machine learning models may be introducing. And there's so many startups in this space. But again, they don't live separate from the investment into cool or fun AI. It is actually part and parcel of building your stack. And I'm hopeful that, this is a thesis that will actually drive the next wave of unicorns. I really do think that, in the future, in the very, very near future, and not because of regulation necessarily, regulation is part of it, but also because of the necessity and the walls we're bumping into, until we are able to adequately address this problem technologically and incorporate different voices and figure out how to solve these very human problems, we will not actually achieve the dreams and goals of our AI vision.
Amazing. Well, thank you for telling us about those different initiatives, and I want to learn more. Chris, I want to get your thought on this, because a lot of people sort of talk about data is the new oil, which we'll leave that phrase there. But I mean, how do we wean people, right, from this idea that there isn't one kind of way to build tech around this kind of let's procure as much data as we can, let's be as kind of embedded as we can. Any thoughts on how we can sort of reframe that or get people to think differently about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would mirror everything that Ruman said, but I also think, again, we've been burdened by a really unfortunate model for at least the last 20 years, which is that companies have been allowed to kind of run rampant, do massive harms, and then perhaps address some of those harms after they've occurred or while they're still occurring, but still continue to do business, and sometimes just continue to do business as usual. If we look to the ways that other industries work, right? Food, drugs, hardware, like toasters, right? Things like that, right? There are all these mechanisms built up for these things where you are typically not allowed to just release something, do massive amounts of damage, and then perhaps address those damages later on. I mean, you can't do that in the food industry, right? You can't do that in the drug industry. And again, like for anyone listening, certainly there are abuses, which I don't discount. But in general, it's not an accepted model, right?
Mhm.
I am not allowed to open up a restaurant, poison as many people as I can, and then open up my restaurant 2.0 and say now I'm going to poison 30% fewer people.
Right.
You're not allowed to do that.
Right.
So I think we just need to change. I mean, we have to come to a better understanding of the ways in which these systems are not so different from other technologies that we've had in the past, right? That
Mhm.
that idea that sort of regulation stifles innovation, and using that as an excuse to for companies to perpetuate all manner of harms, I think has been a disastrous
Hmm.
formulation, not just for individuals, but for countries, and society and democracy. And I am not being hyperbolic there. And so I think that we really need to change that model and that understanding of how systems get released upon the world.
Mhm.
And that I think will really begin to address some of the things that you point to.
Critical. Thank you for those examples. They're so evocative and they make so much sense. So if we're going to be thinking about regulation, then I think this means I'll turn to Suresh, right? And so unfortunately, there are so many significant challenges, right, that this administration is trying to address. Sinan right before us was talking about what's going on in Ukraine. We had earlier a panel around misinformation. So all of this going on, and not to mention very different approaches to this issue of equity, right? According to political parties. So how do we get policymakers on the same page about this?
So I'm glad you asked. So back in October, in a Wired op-ed, our leadership at OSTP launched the start of a policy process so that we could get feedback from industry, academia, from government, civil society, and the public on ways we could ensure that AI was developed in ways that promote equity, privacy, and liberty, amongst other things. And we've had this process been going on for a while. We've had public panels with experts from all across the board. We've received written feedback from groups. We've had numerous meetings with stakeholders, and we've had an open public email address where people could just email us with their thoughts. So to your point about what should we do, but I think what we've learned from all this public engagement is that this is a multi-pronged process. It's not, going back to my point from earlier, there isn't a single thing that government or industry or academia needs to do to address these broader questions. It's a whole coalition of efforts that we have to build together. For example, some of the things we need are good guardrails or best practices in software development. They're simple things like making sure that a product's design includes testing from populations that'll be using it. It's a simple thing, but it already helps address some of the concerns that get raised. Making sure that when the model is tested, it uses data that resembles a deployment context. Making sure there's ongoing monitoring of product. And again, putting my computer science hat back on, this is not things that are unusually surprising to people who work in this space, but it's important to make sure that these get done. Also, we want more rigorous testing to protect people from discriminatory impacts. We want meaningful human oversight. We want public consultation. These are all things that we've heard from our engagements. These are all things that people say. So in some sense, we do have the ideas out there, and the way in which we can execute on them, it depends. We encourage industry best practices. We encourage audit mechanism. We encourage state and local governments to sort of bring these into their thinking around how they procure software. There's a number of ways in which we can do this. And that's how we have been thinking about this, as a coalition and a collection of efforts that together will get us to the place we want to get to.
Absolutely. So the office, OSTP, has said that Americans need a Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world. And, there's a comment from the audience that now that AI is increasingly mainstream, the 2022 AI Index identified ethical and responsible AI as absolutely necessary for AI to be accepted in the wider marketplace. So it seems like perhaps there are going to be more and more people thinking about this. So let me ask you to build upon that and ask, can you talk more about what this Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world might look like, and where sort of the thinking is there?
Yeah. So as I said, we've been talking to a number of stakeholders in the space. We've been trying to articulate what is it that what does it mean to have for technology to have impact, and what is it that we want to protect people, while making sure that we can continue to innovate in all the ways that we've seen innovation in the space, right? And we think about, I talked about rights impacting technologies. We think about people's rights. We think about their access to, we think about opportunities, especially equal opportunities. And we think about access to critical sort of services and resources. And these are the dimensions along which we think it's very important to make sure that we continue to have those rights.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing, of course, in the time-honored American tradition is inspired by, of course, the American Bill of Rights. And we believe that it's important to articulate these values, articulate rights that we think people should have, and then allow our technologists and our creative folks to sort of build to sort of technologies that can help us and respect those rights. So that's the vision we've sort of been working with. And, we hope to, soon have more to say on this. And so all I can say for now is stay tuned. But that's where we're coming from, starting from that impact, starting from what we want to make sure we protect people, looking at the world around us, and then working forward from there.
Yeah, fascinating. An AI Bill of Rights. So Raman, can I ask you about sort of thinking about what firms could or should do, where they could start? Let's imagine we have on the line today people who are listening who may be members of small to medium enterprises, may be interested in startup, or maybe are working in some kind of firm that's larger, but this now has become something that's more on their radar, and that they're thinking about. A recent survey showed that 68% of executives don't really understand the algorithms, the AI that their companies are using. So that coupled with, the application, what sort of advice or where could people start in trying to, in their own organizations, move toward responsible AI?
That's a great question, Renee. And that was pretty much my job at Accenture, right? To work with companies of various sizes to help them start and institute a responsible AI practice. So to that end, I actually have research and a paper on it that I co-wrote with Bobby Rakova, who's now a Mozilla Fellow, Henriette Kramer from Spotify Labs, and Jingying Yang, formerly a partnership on AI. So the four of us got together and we actually literally did this study. And there's sort of a longer report, and there's 5 or 6 different things to specifically focus on. A lot of them are about organizational structure, but I want to highlight the one that stands out the most for me because it comes up repeatedly no matter what audience I'm in, if I'm in a policy audience, industry audience, even just regular people. And that is incentive structures. And there's 2 types of incentives to think about. One is literally people incentives. So in other words, if I'm a machine learning engineer and I'm building products, am I rewarded or valued if I find, identify, and mitigate ethical harms? Or am I seen as a person who is sort of slowing down the project because I'm saying, hey, we have stuff missing in this data set, or this model really isn't actually performing well per these metrics, even if it is, quote, more accurate, right? So there's become this very unfortunate narrative of the fairness accuracy trade-off, which I think is a overly simplistic way of talking about, well, that is only a trade-off if you choose to only optimize for an R-squared value versus things like the impact on your consumer, right? I don't think there are many products that companies launch where they would say, we don't care how it impacts the consumer. We care the most that it is working the fastest. But for some reason with machine learning, that seems to be the prevailing narrative. The second incentive is actually, as I just alluded to, sort of model-based incentives. So I was very surprised. So back to, I guess, going back full circle to the first thing you asked me about this idea of like why I was so surprised to see these this very ambitious place solving what, from my opinion, were very non-ambitious problems. Similarly, I was very surprised, as a quantitative social scientist, to see such an emphasis on an R-squared value or an accuracy value, right? So I think it is because it has the coolest sounding name. And accuracy sounds really great when you're pitching, but accuracy just means something very narrow mathematically. And it is actually embedded in that is bias because it is just how well are you predicting from the data that you have available, right? So sure, but if you have so a good statistician knows that you look at your model from many different angles and many different ways. So how do we build in model incentive structures? And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about there is actually an infrastructure of responsible ML. So as we think about ML ops, how do we think about responsible ML ops? What are the things we should be collecting and tracking about our models that will help us make informed decisions about the ethical use or misuse of the models we're building? So yeah, people want to read that paper. Again, part of it is about organizational structure, organizational dynamics, where you place a team like a responsible AI team. But I think if there's one thing that I think people should focus on, it's incentive structures.
I love that. And, so I recently gave a talk, and afterward, some data science, I had a conversation with some data scientists who were there, and kind of, to your point, the focus seemed to be on kind of the math of the model and less on, well, hang on now, what are the incentives? What impact do we want to have? And sort of why are we doing this? So I think this kind of reframing past merely looking at, kind of the parameters of the model alone is going to be a really important shift. By the way, the audience is asking about some of the documents that you all have mentioned, including the OSTP report, Rumaan, the paper, and so on. So for those of you who are interested in those, we'll make sure to provide links to those afterward. Because I've read some of them, but some of them I haven't. So I want to check them out myself. So I want to turn to Chris for a second here and, talk about the way in which this is presented and how it's made palatable. Sinan, Dean, Dave, and I are all affiliated with MIT's marketing department. And that affiliation, I think, is important because we think about the ways in which this is presented, right, to audiences that make them more likely to adopt or not think about these issues we're discussing, to make it more persuasive, right? So, for instance, many of people have seen the dancing robots, the robots dancing to "Do You Love Me" song. And then, of course, that same technology has been used, police dogs. So the music's really cute. But why is that not cute? Why are those dancing robots not cute? And what do you think that citizens could do about it?
Yeah, so I mean, well, the short answer, right, in the interest of time, is those videos are propaganda. I mean, we could just as easily have images of those dogs patrolling the border, and some of them with some sort of weaponry attached to it, right? It does that too. And so I think that the function of videos like that is to, as you said, make these things palatable, right? So that we don't have videos of them doing no-knock warrants, but that's certainly going to be a thing that they do in the future, right? We don't have videos of them remotely detonating and killing a person, but that's certainly something that they've done, been used to do in the past. And so, I think that those videos serve a really important function. But what I would encourage people to think about is there's a very famous scene from the Terminator, which has like the skeleton of the Terminator stepping on a skull.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time you see a dancing Boston Dynamics robot or any dancing robot, right, dancing in quotation marks, I encourage people to just superimpose that image in their mind as well, because that's really kind of what's going on there.
Yeah, so the cognitive associations we have, we got to think more about that and manage that and think about what those implications might be for different use. So we only have a couple minutes left. And so I want to be very sort of oriented toward action. What could be done? What could somebody start doing in an organization or an individual today? So Suresh, can I ask you, what would an organization, public or private, that is getting it right look like?
That's a good question. So first of all, getting it right is not a destination, but a journey and a process. So getting it right is a work in progress. When you're getting it right, you're not actually getting everything right, but you have a process in place of continual monitoring and evaluation to make sure that you're continuing to do better. And I think that's really important because we continue to realize new dimensions of impact that we hadn't thought about before. Mm-hmm. So we have to always be open to continuously learning and relearning what we don't know. So that's the first thing I want to say. So if you're doing it right, you are in a learning mode and you're monitoring and evaluating and constantly reacting to what you're seeing around you, which means that you have rigorous testing, you have meaningful oversight, you have public consultation, you have meaningful human alternatives. And above all, you're thinking about impact, not about accuracy, not only about metrics, but what those metrics mean in a human context. And that is a sign of an organization that's trying, and I emphasize trying, to do it right.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. So let me ask you then, Raman, as we have, as we are closing up the panel and people are thinking about what they could do right, what they could do next, what could they do? What could they start today or tomorrow to get toward getting it right?
Absolutely. And maybe I'll speak to the audience we were talking about earlier, which are, folks maybe leading companies of various sizes. I would say, carve out meaningful room for responsible AI practices, not as a feel-good function, but as a core business value. I think there is a lot to be said about prioritizing that kind of work, not just in word, but in structure and in practice. And it does not have to mean investing in some complicated systems. It could just mean today's step is how do we get better community engagement? Or, how do we stress test the models we're building from a different lens? Or how do we understand how it works on, different types of communities? Guaranteed you have a data scientist or somebody in your company who is very interested and wants to get involved in this. So how do you support a champion?
Great advice. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Chris, how can we start to get it right? How can somebody do something today that would move toward the right direction?
Yeah, what I would stress is the benefits of collective action, right? Whether that's groups of students at an institution, workers workers at a company, or even kind of like in the example of Atlantic Towers, right? Tenants in a place of house in apartment complex, right? That so much of this stuff, the levers that need to be pushed and pulled can't be done individually, and so we need to act collectively if we hope to get it right.
Very, very well said. Thank you so much, Chris, Suresh, and Raman. It has been a privilege. Thank you for dropping so many jewels today. I've learned a lot. I hope you all have. And Sinan, you're back. Good to see you again. Thank you. And over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. That was a fantastic panel. Really, really appreciated it. So we've come to the end of the day. We are thrilled to have had these very important conversations today. Thank you, first of all, to Renee, to Dave, and to Dean for leading our fantastic panels, to all of our amazing panelists who gave us such great insight. The substance and the purpose of the Social Media Summit is to really think about solutions. And I'm very glad that Renee ended her panel that way. I think you saw every single panel really focus on solutions to algorithmic transparency, solutions to misinformation, solutions for fostering more responsible AI, and also thinking about what it means to have social media be such a critical part of war and geopolitical events, and how we can strive to be aware and to steer social media towards the most productive uses. We also talked deeply about a lot of the challenges and a lot of the dangers and a lot of the threats that technology and social media pose ethically, in terms of privacy, in terms of effects on democracy, in terms of effect on our public health, our mental health. All of these are very real impacts that we have to remain committed to and paying attention to. So thank you also to all of the fantastic folks at the IDE, many of whom I called out at the beginning of this summit. And I want to remind everyone of the tremendous support that we get from our channel partners, Ogilvy, PopTech, Media Hub, WPP, and of course the MIT Sloan School of Management. This has been another really amazing day of conversations at the Social Media Summit. We intend to have this meeting every year, once a year in the spring, to talk about the most pressing issues and how to move them forward. So thanks to all of you for listening and to watching. Please stay tuned to the IDE for much more in terms of research content, but also in terms of public policy, advocacy, and as well relevant content like this. So we will see you next time. Thanks again.